They're at 1:30.
Okay. Welcome back, everybody. I'll just give a little bit of time for people to kind of drift in. Sorry that was such an abbreviated lunch break, but we have a very busy day. We are now going to kick off our lightning round session. The idea here, which was completely flagrantly stolen from the last British DIGRA conference that I attended, is to essentially get a picture of the wider landscape of game preservation from a whole bunch of different fields by getting these little slices of what a lot of you are doing. As before, please put questions in the chat as and when they occur, and make sure to put who the question is for, because we're going to do all of the papers and then we're going to do a Q&A roundup at the end so that we can talk about, connections between them as well as individual papers. Yes, keep the questions coming, and we'll have a nice conversation. We are actually starting off our lightning rounds with a couple of pre-recorded papers where the attendees weren't able to be able to record live, but they wanted to send in their papers and have said that they'd be happy to be contacted with questions. So this is going to start with me sharing my screen. Boom. So we are going to start off with Claire Carroll from the University of Cambridge, talking about regenerative infrastructures, deprecation and accessibility in co-creative interactive fiction. And could someone flag me if you can't hear this?
I thank Jack Orchard and the team for hosting the symposium. I'm going to speak with you today about regenerative infrastructures for developing interactive fiction. And first off, I know we're talking about preservation, but I want to sort of take a moment to talk about conflicting and sort of interrelated definitions of accessibility, because often access in line with preservation just means technically, is this project able to be engaged with and perceived? But I also think there are two additional elements worth considering in terms of a disability-centered lens of sort of, is this an accessible object for people with various assistive technologies to help them engage? And is this socially accessible? Is this something that people feel they have the education and the tools and the comfort that they're able to engage with this? These are sort of interrelated factors in terms of the interactive fiction and text-based game community. So sort of a really brief recap. Interactive fiction or text-based games often comes in two sort of camps. We have parser-based IF, which has sort of, you type in get lamp or go north, and then the text responds, as opposed to choice-based IF, where you will click links or choose from multiple choices in a hypertext sort of framework that will allow you to progress the story. And usually these choices are generally available to everyone, but you also have sort of a subcategory called quality-based narratives, where stats and attributes like experience sort of help you level up and change what is available to the characters. And one of the fun things about interactive fiction is it's made often by individuals. It's often available for free for people to play, so it has a very sort of hobbyist energy, even though the narratives are obviously very engaging, and that means that there's a lot of different tools supporting people's engagement with creating and reading. So it's sort of, the community goes both ways. In terms of options for developing quality-based narratives, some historical tools that you don't really have access to anymore include Undum by Ian Millington, which is a very book-based sort of framework that has a lot of marble paper and a physical idea of a book, and Story Nexus by Feel Better Games, which is led by Alexis Kennedy, which is more digital, and that's sort of the framework that's underpinning their project, Fall in London. But that was deprecated to new projects, sort of from contributors in 2019, and had been completely taken down in 2026. They still use it for Fall in London, is sort of the understanding, but it's not available to the public anymore. And kind of in between these two things were Millington and Kennedy's project Verytale, which was a commercial attempt. So Doom and Story Nexus were free to use and develop with, whereas Verytale was a commercial platform to try to say, hey, we'll help you make projects that are quality-based. And the first and sort of primary example of Verytale was a story named B by Emily Short. And Short is sort of a giant of interactive fiction. She writes a lot of really engaging narratives, and was involved until 2024 at Feel Better Games, working on Fall in London. So sort of very much in the mix here in this community. And she wrote a project about a girl training for a spelling bee. So you play a homeschooled child in a relatively conservative family whose sort of stats, as you can see on the lower left here, your motivation to learn spelling may be low. Your spelling skills can vary based on how much you choose to sort of practice your spelling. That can go up and help you. And then there's a sort of turn-based mechanic around time. So spelling competitions will happen at certain times of the year. And this project was sort of very well received. It won some awards in the IF community, but of course, Verytale was deprecated in 2015. So then sort of what happens to this story? Where does it go? Other platforms were not super able to support it. So Ian Millington did try to port it over into another quality-based tool called Dendry that sort of he was making as sort of a stopgap for Verytale. But it doesn't work very well. At least the version of it now from GitHub just has nothing in it. And it was always acknowledged as incomplete, but it was seen as, oh, you can get partway through. But in 2022, Short worked with Autumn Chen, who is herself an interactive fiction writer and developer, to sort of fully port it out into Dendry and say, oh, I'm going to update this. I'm going to get to all the endings. I'm going to make sure it sort of works in its entirety. And this is sort of now very much available via GitHub. So it's a great project and you can play it. There was some adjustment made to the original text. So Short did add some things and change some statistics, but it was very much intended to stay in the 2012 voice authorially, even if it's a new version. So it's an interesting question for preservation, but in terms of accessing anything, feels, at least to me, better than nothing. But of course, we run into the same problems. This is a cycle that never ends. Dendry, Millington's been busy. Dendry hasn't been updated in 11 years. So this tool is not evolving and growing and sort of improving. Autumn Chen has forked that repository and is committing more updates. So the things are evolving for at least Chen's version of this project. And this is something where Dendry Scope is a sort of scheme to analyze Dendry stories that Chen has developed with Jasmine Otto at the University of California, Santa Cruz, and Adam Smith, also at Santa Cruz. And this is a tool that came out in 2023, so quite recently, to try to view a map of how can you see and analyze these Dendry stories for scholarship. So even if the platform itself isn't evolving as quickly or has been sort of taken off into collaborators' hands, there are new ways being developed to explore these stories. And of course, the narrative that they chose to demonstrate this tool was also B. So it seems like a lot of infrastructure is currently going in to support B and almost exclusively B and some stories that Chen writes. But there's motivation here because people really are invested in this story and want it to continue. Which is just to say that sort of, I think this is not news to anyone, but obsolescence comes for us all. Interactive fiction had a heyday commercially with Infocom in the 80s, but that was sort of fell by the wayside. We had Adobe Flash, but that's gone. Verytale and Dendry may be gone, but collaboration can help sort of perpetuate these stories and help keep them alive. If Short hadn't handed it off to Chen and Millington, this would not have been a priority and we wouldn't be able to play B today. So just to, I know I'm slightly over time, but just to look at the takeaways really quickly, I think if we're thinking about preservation and the regeneration, sort of the rewriting of stories to sort of maintain their technical accessibility, we still have to have considerations into sort of how do tools work with screen readers and supportive tech, because a lot of the quality-based narratives are much harder for screen readers than traditional interactive fiction via parsers, which is really easy for screen readers. Socially, the documentation is often not a priority because developers are working on their free time. So how do we make sure that people can continue to use this and write with this and learn how to keep using these tools to help expand the collaborative base? And technically, sort of along that vein, how can you maybe make things more open source and make things more accessible to other developers to continue? So yeah, thank you very much for your time. Obviously, feel free to email me if you have any questions, and I look forward to watching the recordings of your presentations too. Thank you. Hi, my name is Carroll.
Okay. And so that was Claire Carroll from University of Cambridge, who, as she said, you can contact her. This recording will become part of the overall recording, so you can catch email addresses and things from there. Next up, we have got Ivan Barroso, Ivan Barroso from University Lusófona, who is reimagining a missing Game Boy history. And I'll just kick this one straight off.
Thank you so much for attending my small talk or writing talk about video game preservation. In this case, I'm going to talk a bit about reimagining a missing Game Boy history. First, I want to take a moment just to thank you for attending and for being there to see it. My name is Ivan Barroso. I've been been developing game for 20 years, although I'm also in the academia for almost 20 years as well. I'm certified by Ubisoft International Game Design. I've been a part of PlayStation First. I have some or a few scientific articles. I just finished my PhD in game studies. So this is just my small background. And today I'm just going to present you a little bit of what is Portugal and what is the game development scene. Game development scene that started in 1980s, that of course, like many others, started with microcomputers. And in the next decade, it was also filled with still some microcomputers experiments, but also personal computers. And although there were consoles and Japanese consoles being officially distributed in Portugal, both from Nintendo and from Sega, including the Game Boy, there was no development for consoles in that period of time. So this gives way to a speculative design question. What started this project was, what if a Portuguese game decided to make a Game Boy game in that period? How would it be? And this enters into speculative design, which, as Sagan mentions, it's a way of trying to create these ruptures, this disruptive speech, or to discuss possible worlds. Not in the possible world in the future, but what if in the past? This is where it emerges Alentejo Team Swap, Game Boy game that was influenced by television, comic books, literature, and films from the specific period of the 1990s in Portugal. Specifically, one which is called Alentejo, which brought a narrative about what if Alentejo was in the 19th century Western. And that was the major idea where it was based. And of course, it also had a lot of research on the period, the professions, the type of housing, the type of people, the type of concerns that were in that period. And of course, a lot of design research, seeing other period games and how do they dwell upon creating gameplay elements for camera, exploration, dialogue, shooting. And that was a part of the equation. The second part of the equation was, what if there was a sequel? If there was a sequel, what can we expect from a sequel? So, Alentejo Team Swap give way for Alentejo, the Tinto, and the Ugly. And here we try to introduce, we see the introduction of two things, the speculative design and the value of authenticity. So, the expectations usually for a Game Boy sequel were in technical and creative. We know this through research. We can see that whenever trade press acknowledges what is expected from a specific Game Boy or any other system, it's usually from technical side and from creative side. So from technical side, of course, animation, art, more sounds, more music. From creative part, keeping the core ideas but expanding them. And as Mitrovic as an editor said, that speculative design is not just about speculative design, it's a series of practice in design. And that's what encompasses it as a form of doing stuff. So for this, Ointers de Tinta Diego, we can see that everything would expand and to meet the expectations of the audience, let's say. Now the game was really compatible with Game Boy and a lot of Game Boys, and you could play it in cartridge format and put it on your old Game Boy if you managed to have one and still play it. So the authenticity was there. And this kind of disruptive, this kind of backward speculative way of engaging with the past and what we consider the preservation of it, it's also what drives Anna's, and she already presented a very curious work about it. And so what we get with Ointers de Tinta Diego, we see, of course, the graphics have improved, but also the gameplay has been improved, and the hours of it and what was expected from a sequel was improved. So, but the important thing is, do people see it like that? Do people comment on it? And as you can see by this digital footprint of the title, journalists, websites, television, radio, influencers, TikTokers, Instagrammers that approach the game all spoke about this question of authenticity. All the game feels authentic. All the game feels like something that was brought from the past, but to the present, like was always there, but just now was found. So it was a very curious example. There's a few numbers over it. As you can see, it was really well received and it was praised for it. But in conclusion, we can see what these speculative what-if scenarios and through this speculative design can help us to challenge this video game historiography and even the preservation practices. By producing this new artifact, how do we consider it? Do we consider an object from the past, an exercise from the future, or something resembling? And these questions also are memory, or cultural memory, or experimental methodologies and inquiries with game studies. Yes, it's an obsolete hardware that's been using contemporarily, but still keeping a lot of things from the past and preserving those methods, preserving those processes. And here we can debate about what is nostalgia and how it conflicts us and how it constructs itself for us on our way to seeing the preservation of the past somehow. Here are just some references if you want to indulge them in knowing anything more. I just want to say thank you, and thank you so much for attending this small lightning talk. And if you want to go and explore the game is available on Loading Studios PT. And if you want to contact me, you have my contacts. Thank you so much.
Okay. And yes, Ivan can also be reached at the contact details there. So for our first live lightning talk, we have Josefien van Scheijndel from the Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam, who's going to talk about playable heritage, comparing institutional strategies for gameplay preservation and community engagement in the Netherlands and the UK. Share your screen and go ahead.
Yes, I will. Let me see. I hope everyone can see it.
All good.
Yeah, okay. So hello everyone, my name is Josefien van Scheijndel, and I will be talking about my master thesis that I wrote last year. Let me see. Next slide. Why is it not going to the next slide? Yes, sorry. To briefly explain my personal interest in this topic, my love for video games actually started at a very young age, and even before I could play games myself, I often watched my brothers play games, and later I watched a lot of Let's Play videos on YouTube, and that became popular. And these pictures that you see, these are, for example, the games that my brothers played. And watching others play made me realize that the experience of video games is not just about the game itself. It's also just meaning like the software on the disc, but it's also everything surrounding it. Commentary, online communities, memes, just a unique way players interact with the game. And this raised some questions for me. If games gain meaning not only from the game itself, but also from what happens around it, how can institutions preserve that? But also what exactly should be preserved in general? So these questions led me to my central aim of my thesis, and that's to explore how cultural institutions approach preservation of paratext, which I will explain later, specifically gameplay and the extent of community involvement in practice. And to do this, I compared two institutions that work with video game heritage, which is the Netherlands Institute for Sound and Vision and the National Video Game Museum in Sheffield. And and by looking at both Dutch and UK context, I examined how different institutional missions, structures, and projects shape their approaches to preserving gameplay and engaging with gaming communities. And my methodology consisted of a comparative discourse analysis. I also conducted interviews with two people, Jasper Snoeren at the Institute at Sound and Vision, and John O'Shea at the National Video Game Museum, which I want to thank again, because without them, this would not have taken shape, my thesis. So I am immensely grateful to them. And the sources that I analyzed were collection policies, institutional documents, and what I called community engagement projects, which I will delve into later. To make sense of institutional strategies, my thesis draws on various theoretical concepts. I know a lot of speakers today have talked about it, but it's foundational to my thesis, so I will quickly just go through it. And that is games as assemblage. So that means the assemblage theory means that rather than seeing a game as like a single static object, assemblage theory suggests that a game is made up of many interconnected components. So hardware, software, controllers, setting, players, online platforms, and so on, just a lot. And these elements interact and combine in different ways, shaping how the game is experienced and understood. And the second theory, which is related to this video games being an interconnected system, is the theory of paratext, which are the materials surrounding a frame of work, and that originates from literary studies, but it can be applied to video games. For games, this can be from menus, title screens, loading screens, box art, blogs, YouTube videos, let's plays, diaries. And these paratexts are not like complementary to the game, but they shape how we interpret and remember it. And the last concept is participatory culture, which was also explained this morning. But essentially, this means like players are not just passive consumers, but are active co-creators of how we make meaning to games. And together, these concepts help shift the focus from preserving a single, material object to preserving a broader network of materials, practices, and interpretations around gameplay. So, then we'll go into my main findings, and I cluster them into three segments, with the first one being how the institutions, so Sound and Vision and National Video Game Museum, approach games and preservation in general. Both institutions recognize that games are more than just physical artifacts. They acknowledge the importance of context, player, platforms, and surrounding media. And they both work with strategies like emulation, documentation, and selective collection to deal with technological obsolescence. At the same time, they have to make pragmatic choices about what they can realistically preserve. The second part is about paratext and specifically gameplay and how these institutions approach this. Both institutions collect developer-related materials, but I noticed that the MVM places slightly more emphasis on community contributions such as fan letters, photos, and player memories. Sound and Vision both a research institution, archive, and also museum prioritizes more formally authorized materials. And yes, I will go quickly. And overall, both institutions aim to preserve not only the games themselves, but also the cultural practices of game production and play. And the last part of my analysis is the community engagement projects. Both institutions do these projects where they approach the gaming communities, and Wietse also talked about Game On and the Games Canon, but these projects show how institutions increasingly involve players in documenting gaming culture by recording gameplay experiences and collecting community stories. However, they also demonstrate a balance between participation, institutional control. Institutions encourage public contribution while still maintaining a professional standards and curatorial frameworks. So my findings show that video game preservation is shifting from a purely top-down archival model towards a more participatory collaborative approach, while still maintaining some institutional control. The comparison between National Media Archive, the comparison between these two institutions, is also suggests that there's no single correct model of preservation. Instead, collaboration between different types of institutions and between institutions and gaming communities will likely be crucial. Ultimately, this means recognizing that we are not only preserving software and hardware, but also the cultural practices and player experiences that give games their meaning. So this was my lightning talk about my thesis, which is a very short amount of time, but I hopefully during the Q&A I can elaborate more on my thesis. But this is my main core of my thesis.
Oh, thank you very much. That was an incredible amount to encapsulate in that amount of time. Well done. Okay, so Willem, we were going to have you next, but I'm afraid Ross is going to get kicked out of the room that he's in fairly soon. So could we move him up? Is that all right?
Yeah, no problem.
Thank you. So next up, we've got Ross Fifield. Who's based at the University of York's EGI program, and he's going to be advocating the case for a games library network. Take it away.
Thank you so much. Let me just share my screen and we'll crack on. Okay, so yes. Thank you for the kind invitation to the Digital Scholarship team. I'm a user-centered designer and postgraduate researcher at the University of York. My research focuses on pre-play multiplayer negotiation. But what I'd like to do is talk to you about my PhD side quest today, which is stimulating the widespread collection of games. That should come with a caveat. I'm not a historian or an archivist, but I do have a few ideas that I'd like to share with you, which I hope are useful. This talk has its genesis in the many seminars and lectures where the audience was asked whether they played a particular game that I've been in. And I've noted large chunks of the audience who haven't played the game tend to get left behind in the discussion because they're not familiar with it. And I feel quite strongly if you're going to cite a source, it should be made available, at least as part of the writing list. So the key point I want to kind of highlight is we don't tend to maintain large libraries of games in our teaching places, much less in public libraries. And that's really where I'm coming from with this talk. So just a brief talk about the history and the benefits of public libraries. Libraries are multifunctional institutions. I've listed a few of the benefits here. And I think that whilst libraries are primarily a centre of knowledge and learning, crucially and really importantly, they can democratise access to the material they hold. And that's really the key point here that I'm trying to make. I've got a very UK-centric focus on this, so I'm going to speak mainly to the UK. The first public libraries began to emerge in the 1850s with the enactment of the Public Libraries Act 1850. That primary legislation has been updated like 2 or 3 times since then. But prior to this, access to books and learning were almost exclusively governed by the aristocracy and the clergy. I think we're in a much better place today than when we are, but there's still much work to be done. So that leads on to an important question, which is, advocating, the social justice element and the equity element of access to material. You find that books, films, and other digitized artworks are, quite ubiquitous in the preservation space. And there are some really good and quite well-resourced public bodies which do work in that area. But outside of work in kind of museum collections and occasional private collections, there's not so much there for games. And the key point is that not everyone can access games on most platforms, or most games, to their detriment. So moving on, who gets preserved? And I do want to talk a little bit about social equity briefly. Working class people are critically underrepresented in the UK game sector, and they mainly make up about 13% of the workforce, despite accounting for about 37% of the population, which is lower than both gender and ethnic minority representation in the industry. So if you were to reflect the UK's actual working population, the industry would need about 6,000 more developers from working class backgrounds. So, there's an important equity there that I wanted to highlight. And, I think the key points there, not only should we be concerned about who is making our games, but who chooses what games get preserved and what becomes part of cultural heritage. There are political elements to this, and I just want to highlight some of the features of, media which is curated. Digital games presents prescriptive features that you don't see in other creative media. And some of the media there, you can see they can be purchased, resold, lent, borrowed, but that's not always the case with digital games. And in fact, once a game has been obtained or accessed or, sold, it's not transferable. And they're underpinned by two features. One is the DRM, the software licensing protection that is embedded within the software, and also they're protected legally under copyright and contract law. And that makes collecting games quite problematic. Initiatives such as Stop Killing Games have sprung up, but, important figures in the industry, such as Marcus Persson, has weighed in on them. If publishers are going to say that you're buying a license and not a product, then, is that really something that you're pirating or copyrighting? I'll move on because I'm conscious of time here a little bit. There are commercial frictions there, and this is something which I see as exacerbating and developing over time, and it's not going to slow down, which is that games are sold as disposable, recreational entertainment media, yet games, more importantly, are getting more and more importance as something people access perpetually. People find their game, they find the communities of games. And really the challenge in establishing libraries is reconciling that commercial friction with, the cultural, entertainment, that people want to preserve. But then that commercial friction there. So it does beg the question, why don't we just have public arcades? Well, arcades have existed in the UK and beyond, but they frequently, sit alongside other social activities like bars and pubs. And really, it does beg the question, if can games be produced for a home audience and then translated into the public space? Should they? I don't know. I think that's a question worth discussing. There are also elements about, the cultural justice, of, preserving games. So, there's a quote there from, Intergame's difficulty level report that was published in 2024. I think it's not controversial to suggest that games are the most important. Still retailing take a million amount of time. I kind of agree with that. I don't think that's controversial. But it does also beg the question, why are games missing from our educational spaces, from our public libraries, if they're so important? Well, I've highlighted some of the frictions and the barriers to doing so. So what can we do about it? These are ideas, and I'll wrap up. I can see I'm coming up on time. So there's a few ideas there that I've put on screen, and I'll happily discuss those in more depth. The key one is the one highlighted in bold at the bottom. I want to advocate for a national games library service. Initially started as an archive, as a reference library, but which could be potentially widened in scope, given extra resource to support educational institutions, and maybe even make its way into the public library system, at a time when public libraries aren't widely accessed in our community as much as we might like. Perhaps access to games within libraries may reinvigorate a whole new generation of playing games in public spaces, and who knows, picking up a book while they're there. So the real question is, can academics and publishers get along with this and present something that's viable for industry? That's something for discussion. There's a few ideas here that we can do individually, and I can see I'm coming up on time. So I'll invite any further questions that people may have. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much. That was absolutely brilliant. Next up, we've got the displaced Willem. Willem Hilhorst is who works at the Netherlands Institute for Sound and Vision, along with Vrije. And he's going to be talking about Going Dutch, preserving games in a playable state. Take it away.
Yeah, thank you so much. I hope everyone can hear me and see my presentation. So I will not be approaching this from the academic point of view, but mostly from the point of view of me as a media manager at Sound and Vision, specialized in games. I've been there since 2021, and I am specifically responsible for helping with the acquisition, the archival, and the preservation of the games in our institute. That's a wide range of responsibilities. I also help with archiving websites and podcasts, so digital board media. That's kind of my forte. I'm also an elected board member of FGAMP, which is notable to mention, which is the European Federation for Game Archives and Media Preservation Projects. If you aren't aware, please check that out. So Vita already talked a lot about our games collection, so I won't go over the repeated details, but as we said, our focus is on keeping the games playable and just focused on games from the Netherlands, developed by Dutch people or Dutch studios. We work a little bit differently because we don't have a legal deposit law, so we don't get the games automatically, but rather we have to go out and request the games through the rights holders. Our approach is a little bit different in that sense that we want to make sure that we can legally preserve these games in our collection. That means that we can circumvent certain issues that would prop up otherwise because the rights holder is on board with preserving their game with us from the word go. Well, how do we achieve or archive this? We want to keep them in a representative playable state for the users of our archive. That could be research purposes, that could be reuse purposes. In a certain sense, we also try to make sure that media professionals can reuse the materials from our collection. And we want to make sure that these games live on, can be used. But as you might suspect, that is a very difficult challenge because our collection is very broad. It's from the 1980s all the way to 2026. That's a lot of games, I can tell you, even not including just those in the games canon that Wietse mentioned, but also beyond that. Like we try to work with new creators as well, and that creates a lot of new materials. And a lot of these games, as you might be aware if you work in another national institute, haven't been documented as well as other games. An NES emulator might be run specifically for Super Mario Brothers, but getting Redcat Rekenen 1 to work on a Windows PC emulator requires a lot of manual checks. Which is also why we default to digital preservation, because the physical materials will deteriorate over time. And we are just a small team within the larger Sound and Vision Institute. We are only with 3 in total. So that is quite a difficult challenge. So how do you approach this? So our solution has been what we've dubbed the emulation package. This is a self-contained portable copy of the game with a dedicated emulator, documentation, a manual, and our package can be accepted within the archival structure. As Wietse mentioned as well, our archive is built and designed for radio, TV, and more traditional AV media. So it doesn't really like to eat games or executable files, so to speak. So we created these packages to make sure that it's all contained into one and can be accepted into the archive. We can add metadata structures as well, and it allows us to basically circumvent maintaining multiple hardware platforms. We do have them. We can point to them for the emulation purposes, but it should be also migration proof. So we have it running on a single dedicated PC system with extensive documentation, and we can migrate these packages over pretty easily. And they're also plug and play. So hopefully the end user going to our archive can go at it immediately without too much of a hassle or technical background. You can see a couple of the examples of our emulation packages on screen. As you can see, it's very much the files in there, but the one on the bottom left is actually how compact we try to keep it, with a copy of the game as an ISO in this case, then documentation as a flat text, no makeup. We just want to have it as straight as possible. And to give you the demonstration, like this is how quickly I can get an old A2 Racer game to run using our emulator. Here we use RetroArch as a front end, though that differs depending on the emulation and also on the state of the game. Some games work better in separate emulators than others. But here you go, going straight into Windows, straight into playing the game. And within less than about 30 seconds, I am in Amsterdam racing on the streets. As you are all aware, Amsterdam has a massive highway running through it. So obviously you can go ahead straight away and play the game. And this is the ease of access we want to provide using these emulation packages. It has to be quick, snappy to the point, as well as documented. So yeah, I always think that's quite fun. Technically, I wanted to go a little bit more in depth about these because we use open source emulation solutions. Those are 86box, DOSBox Pure, CDI-MU, a lot of wide-ranging platforms because our games are not limited to one specific platform. And we try to use these solutions that have been built by the community because we are not programmers. We are very technically skilled to an extent, but we are not able to design our own emulators, nor do we have the resources for that. We can also fine-tune these for every single individual game included, so that's really helpful and nice. And we take the performance base that's on the physical box, disk, or spec sheet that was provided to us by the rights holder to make sure they play. We take priority with playability over accuracy. So the question was mentioned about peripherals and that sort of thing. We have a couple of them, and we keep them alongside the hardware, but we want to keep the game playable as a primary source, and that is kind of our focus. So the periphery often gets lost. In a sense, I'm just putting flex tape on everything and sticking it all together, but it works in a practical sense. For the existing archive, Vitsa already showed this image, which shows our metadata structure. Again, we're kind of tricking the system by keeping the metadata in similar lines to how you would archive a television or radio program, but we give every single item an individual metadata level. So that's both video game recordings, images, the game itself, and then documentation. Those are individual programs that our archive can accept. And then the emulation package itself is our master file, because that one is supported as a zip file by the archive as well. And that means that the games are coexisting alongside contextual materials and audiovisual media in our archive. They are not accessible from our portals, only on site in a dedicated reading room, so to speak. That is just a limitation of what would work, but we can keep them playable within the walls of our institute, because that's what the rights holders agree to the moment we sign with them. Okay, I cheated. I added a slide because someone brought up live services. And yes, we are crying in a corner, but we do have actually some things on that. So you're just seeing our 3 games that we have that work with a web-based game and apps, including the bottom one, which is Kweester der Lage Landen, which is still live as of right now. And we are doing emulation packages for these with Docker and running these through emulation with a connection to the local server that we emulate in Docker. So you have the local server, the original files provided to us by the developers, and then we can connect that to the emulator, in this case for Kamergotchi, which is an app. It looks for the local server. The programmer was kind enough to help us with this. He went to our building, sat down for a few hours, made the connection, changed the values, and made it so it can run self-sufficiently in just this server. So we turn it on manually. It's not even accessible for the audience unless we turn it on. So it is also secure in a sense. And for these games, it works because they're single player live games, online games. But yeah, it's a good development. So we are working on this. We're trying to get that MMO working, but I think that might be a bit more challenging. But this is kind of how we fit it all into that emulation package. And then also, yeah, what does that give you in the end? Well, for us, it helps to keep these games alive. So what you're seeing here is, for example, a presentation we gave on Amsterdam. Yes, noted. And, that makes that people can understand these games, play them, view them in context. And then we have these arcade machines, which are basically front ends for a PC, but allow us to make these games playable at events because they're technically still within the walls of sound and vision. So we can show them to other people. The Super Great Box game you see, it's over 10 years old. I was showcasing it at an event and someone told me, "You made such a fun game." And I'm like, it's not mine. Someone else made it. And that's because the memory of these games is slowly ebbing away. And this helps to keep them alive with the help of the rights holders. So if I can give you a takeaway, find contacts with rights holders, try to find clever but self-sufficient solutions if you can, and you can embed this into larger institutions that aren't dedicated to just games. If you want to know more, you can reach out to me or my colleagues. If you want to know more about FCamp, you can do so as well. And I'd like to thank you all for your attention. And share your questions if you have them.
Fantastic. Well done. I didn't even need my time once.
Yes, that's how we do it.
Nailed it. All right. Next up, we have Jean Ketterling from the University of Saskatchewan, who is going to talk about how can we preserve pornography games amid sex panics and deplatforming. Yep, all good. Your text has appeared.
All good? Cool.
Yep.
Alrighty. Thanks so much for having me, folks. It's a real pleasure to be with you all here today. So yeah, my name is Jane Ketterling. My affiliation is there for you, but I think the most important thing to mention is that I work on sex and porn in video games and not so much preservation. The preservation piece is really as a result of this work I'm doing right now. I'm going to be talking to you today about this question I've been thinking about and asking game developers this year. So how do we, or how can we preserve pornography games amid sex panics and deplatforming? And I've been doing this work in the context of a SSHRC-funded research project called the Pornography Platforms and Play Project, which is a group effort. So I want to acknowledge the work that Rachel Weatherspoon, Claire Kim, and Sophia Fisher have been doing as research assistants on this project. And before I dig into that project, I just want to offer a quick content note. So the project, like most of my work, concerns pornography, and the presentation and my approach to answering questions will include frank discussions of sex, including kink. But getting into it, so in June 2025, I found out that I had gotten the grant I just mentioned, which was to study the social, economic, and political forces that shape the unavailability of pornography games on Steam, itch, and Yotaku. It's something I'd been interested in for a number of years. I was really excited to get that project off its feet. And then a month later, I woke up and found that a substantial part of my intended archive was gone, as you see here. So I don't have time to fully unpack this, but to very quickly summarize, an Australian anti-pornography group called Collective Shout had lobbied payment processors, so MasterCard, PayPal, etc., to put pressure on Steam and itch and have them remove content, namely rape and incest fantasy content that Collective Shout sees as promoting and glorifying violence against women. This was initially focused on one game called No Mercy, which is a relatively, I would argue, pedestrian, like stepmom incest fantasy game, which the developer has explicitly defended as kink and fantasy. The result was the implementation of a new set of policies concerning sexual content at both Steam and itch, which is very similar to the policies we're seeing MasterCard require across like sex work platforms as well. But for structural reasons, itch delisted all adult games, and while they have since relisted free adult games, the capacity to search for those games is still really limited, and I'm not entirely convinced they have relisted those games in any meaningful way. So this is sort of my usual niche, right? Games, sexuality, and legal studies. And if you want my analysis on why I think these moves to censorship are bad and harmful, particularly for queer communities, you can see my writing and talking about these issues in these places. But today I want to focus on a different question. So how can we as researchers, game preservationists, citizen archivists, and game developers ensure that pornographic video games are preserved for research purposes and for their own sake as important pieces of cultural heritage that record and represent human experience with sex and sexuality? And there does seem, from what I've seen at least, to be a big gap here, or at least there's an appearance of a gap because people don't necessarily make their work preserving porn games public for a variety of reasons. For my research in this project, which currently includes 99 surveys and 22 interviews with developers affected by policy changes on Steam and itch, there are two ways that folks are generally responding. So first, many are simply too busy dealing with the emerging issue and the financial repercussions on them and their families to even think about preserving their games, other than maybe getting their own game files backed up or moved to file storage services that don't also have anti-porn policies. So they're feeling squeezed off multiple platforms, and they're trying to maintain their livelihoods. Second, some game developers, especially those who identify as artists, I would say, are cobbling together strategies which might include sharing torrents of game collections, downloading their game collections onto physical storage devices, trying to spread their games out over multiple platforms, and making their own websites. So this is all very piecemeal, and their private efforts at preservation are stymied by punitive platform policies. Notably, none so far have discussed reaching out to more formal game preservation venues or informal but public venues. And so in relation to that, there's three things I want to raise here. So first, the existing challenges inherent in archiving disparaged sexual content, including video games, and board games as well, which we could talk about in the Q&A. The political importance of archiving media at the center of censorship, maelstroms, and efforts to violently erase sexual and gender diversity. And third, the ethical trickiness of archiving porn, especially porn made by marginalized people. So as I've started to talk to folks who are experts in game preservation, again, because I am not, one thing I have heard is that what gets archived is intertwined with the risk-averse nature of museums and archives and their prioritization of family and funder-friendly collections, which can filter out anything that might be flagged as controversial, political, or risque, so violence, but also, I would say, especially stigmatized material like pornography. And this is something other archivists in other sectors have pointed out as well. Academic institutions, I would say, can also face some of these issues depending on their jurisdiction and maybe most importantly on the tenure status or otherwise the sort of the precarity of the folks who might want to work on pornography at academic institutions. And so all of this seems to add up to mean that if people are preserving these games, and please tell me if you are, or you know people who are, these archives don't seem to be publicly searchable in any meaningful way. So I, at least, don't have a sense of what preservation efforts might look like or what gaps might exist. And this has been a problem for a long time, but the current political and internet governance climate also makes it really urgent. So participants, many of whom are queer and trans, emphasize their knowledge that efforts to deplatform their pornographic games are connected to emerging forms of fascism and political violence and erasure levied at the trans community specifically. So in this context, I think we have to ask ourselves what risks might be necessary for us to take on and what it means symbolically, rhetorically, if pornography continues to be a notable absence in archives, both formal and informal. But of course, we know that solving this erasure is not simple. We have to consider what ethical and consensual archiving looks like in that context. Given their tenuous position and the fact that deplatforming produces economic hardship, developers are often deeply concerned with confidentiality. They also face growing risks around criminalization. So in the US, the Heritage Foundation of Project 2025 fame has called for all pornographers to be incarcerated. And my understanding is that there is maybe some legal changes happening in the UK as well that might be affecting folks. So the question becomes, how can we, academics, archivists, game preservationists, citizen archivists, help preserve this set of often dismissed, if not outright reviled games? How can we support this work despite the institutional barriers that might exist for us? And how can we do so in ethical ways? And these questions always impress upon me the importance of working with sex-positive archives, like, for example, the sexual representation. I see the 10-second coming or time. Okay, so I'll just say it's important to work with folks who are doing this work, including pornography archives and stuff like that. And I'm happy to discuss some of that in the Q&A. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Sorry to stop, but we
are. That's great.
And yes, cold questions for Q&A. So much more I want to hear from everybody, to be honest. Next up, we've got Dany Guay-Bélanger from the Université de Montréal, who is talking about the acceptable side of mediocre, exploring the Let's Play interview model through middling games. Yes, take it away.
Thank you for the introduction. So, hi everyone. Basically, this is part of my PhD research that I'm doing at UDM, and I'll go quite quickly, but basically I'm trying to find better ways to do game preservation and game history, to research game history. And part of that is through oral history, but also through games that might be considered average, or some people might call mediocre, as you probably see in the quote in my title. So just going quickly, one of my case studies is Jersey Devil. It's a game that came out in 1998. It was made fully in Quebec, probably the first console game made in the province. And it's quite important for that because Quebec is quite important in terms of game development. It is the center, at least in Canada, of game development. It sells about 400,000 copies, which is not bad for a game that size and for a small company that was kind of starting. It's a fairly creative game and has some really interesting things in it. It draws inspiration from Saturday morning cartoons. It draws from Halloween. It has a cryptoid, the Jersey Devil, as its titular character. But it also had several issues, like some severe issues, like controls and camera, which of course became kind of problematic and kind of hurt its success. Now, why focus on a game like that, right? Because it's described by some people, even at the time, as smacking of middle of the roadness, as being more recently even described as average and forgettable. And when you're looking at the game on Moby Games and they're using their ranking, it's almost smack in the middle, which is why I chose middling games, because at first I was going with mediocre, and my supervisor was like, that might be a little insulting. He was right. So I went with middling, which fit quite well, especially for Jersey Devil. But these games that are more at risk of disappearing because they are in the middle, right? They're not the most successful, so they get a lot of popularity and notice, or the very, very bad ones, which of course we also remember, E.T., for instance. And so, we can do a lot of research on these games or in games in general through like netnographies or paratext, all good. But of course, I felt like something was missing from that, especially if we're focusing on the player side of things. And a way to kind of fix that is going through all histories. So there are all histories of games. I'm not the first person to use that for game preservation. However, most of the very big projects up until fairly recently were very much focused on, focusing on developers, on the pioneers. So kind of a great men situation, which I've called the great game theory, focusing on the commercial successes on the big games, all stuff like that. There are alternatives, of course, and Josefien actually described two of my examples quite well and was using them, so I'm not going to spend much time describing them because we've heard about them a lot, but they're good and I like them. So what I ended up creating is a new approach to doing an oral history of video games, drawing inspiration from what I saw from these two places, the NVM, of course, and the Netherlands Institute for Sound and Vision, and try to combine it with life story interviews, which created a format that is in 3 parts, where you do kind of a speed run of life story interview in about 45 minutes instead of the hour and a half, maybe 2 hours it usually takes. Asking questions to people like, who they are, what's their relationship to games and to the specific game you're researching, because for that model, it's focusing on a specific game, and their memories of the game, of course. Second part, we play the game, so kind of a let's play situation. But I tried also to add some authenticity to it, meaning that if people were usually playing the games alone, then I let them play alone. I was just a spectator. And if they usually played with someone or did like couch co-op or something, I offered them that if they wanted to share the controller, if they wanted to play together, then we could. And so many people did that as well, which was quite fun for me and for them, of course. And then the third part was going over that experience. How was the game different? How were your memories different from what you experienced, and going over that. So in a way, having a perspective and an approach that shared authority, meaning that, the people who are participating in these interviews are the experts on their own memories and on their experiences, meaning bringing them in. I put also a couple of restrictions because I wanted to test some things out. One of them was test some of my mentors' guidance, which was, always do interviews with at least another person to at least take care of the cameras. It was like, there's technology for that. We might be able to trump that with technology. I was very wrong. My interviews are typically fine. I had some issues, but it typically works. But technology will not save us. Absolutely not. Though, while doing this, the interview method definitely works. It's definitely good. It has limitations, but it works fairly well, especially for what I'm trying to do. But of course, I'm not just doing that. I'm also comparing it to other types of research and creating kind of these like game files, and archives where you would have these interviews alongside other material, so like ethnography material or paratext, or paratext. And one of the other things I realized, apart from challenging sometimes your mentors, is not necessarily the best of ideas. sometimes it is, you need to test things out, but still, is that actually I was surprised to see that there was a lot more resonance between what I found in the interviews and within the ethnography and paratext that I was finding. At first, I expected it to be, complementary for sure, but perhaps showing different things. But no, it's very, very much aligned. What I saw in the interviews was quite close to what thank you, I'm almost done, was quite close actually to what you saw in other types of research. Now, the difference really is that in an oral history interview, you have a lot more time. You can go much more in depth rather than just amassing a bunch of interviews. It's so much work. You're not going to get, 100 interviews, especially if you're working alone. But when you're going for an ethnography or paratext, you might get a lot more material. So, both are complementary. And then the last thing I saw was I was expecting a lot more nostalgia, but what I saw is, yes, I saw some nostalgia, but I also noticed that people critically engaged with the games, both in the interviews where they're put in a situation and in a context where they have to do that because they're playing the games, they're remembering them, and then going back over that. But also online, people were actually saying hey, I feel nostalgia for this game, or, oh, it was much different than I remembered. And so there's a really kind of a critical approach to that, which I was not necessarily expecting, and I think is quite refreshing because often nostalgia is seen as a bad thing. And so those are pretty much the things I learned doing this, and I'll be happy to answer more questions in the question period. Thanks very much.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Once again, didn't need my time. Brilliant. Keep thinking of questions in the chat. So next up, we have Daniel Gardner from the Robert Gordon University in Aberdeen, who's going to speak on permission to preserve or getting comfortable with not owning games, a theoretical, legal, and practical challenge. Off you go. Not hearing anything.
Not seeing anything either. Sorry about that.
Good.
But hopefully I won't go over time now, especially because of that. But I feel I need to add a quick disclosure or just a disclaimer at the beginning because of some of the other talks. Preservation is not my primary focus of study either. It's sort of something on the periphery of what I study. I primarily would say identify as a boring studies scholar for fans of Susan Lee Starr. I study interactions and sort of infrastructures on the periphery of other things. And so, today I'm here to talk about how that sort of relates to games. But historically, who have we had to ask for permission to play games? I'd say our parents, right? If a more visceral, omnipresent authority exists, I'm not sure I know what it is. But now, who must us, entirely grown adults, ask for permission from to play digital games on an everyday basis? Well, the answer is publishers and platforms, and we do so regularly. Those who make games used to be content selling their wares like any other recreational commodity. Your relationship with game makers ended at the point of sale when you, dear players, right, sort of became the owner of the game and you took it home. Not the game TM, but the physical artifact used to play the theoretical construct of whatever game rules influenced its, construction. But what elements of games or play can we ever really own? This sort of plays into some of the other talks already again, but how much can we own the game of anything, right? Certainly FIFA, for example, owns institutional expressions of it, but who owns the game of football? Only players can really own expressions of gameplay that they participate in because no one else really is ever there doing the thing. With older games, players could own the nets or balls or different collections of cardboard and plastic pieces, but players could then even lend those out to friends and create their own terms and conditions for those loans. Even early discs and cartridges could be lent, borrowed, or even stolen in much the same way. However, players are not permitted to own digitally distributed games, and lending or imposing our own terms of use is explicitly prohibited by the terms of our own continued access. Before accessing any digital gameplay, two processes must always occur. Authorization occurs during initial game access or upon installation. It generally looks something like this, right? Our access is authorized provided we agree to these terms. However, it's really essential that this agreement is increasingly actually about us authorizing publisher and platform claims about who can influence or own aspects of the software and our experiences with it and our data. authentication occurs every time we access digital gameplay. Initially, it looks something like this, but we may even automate it, sort of hiding it from our attention. It confirms only authorized players access gameplay in a way that never really was a part of games or gameplay historically, or at least other than our parents. We did not traditionally negotiate with and seek permission from a third party structurally imposed between us and every instance of participation in gameplay. Together, these processes dictate the explicit, pragmatic, and even the civil relationships that we are allowed to have with games in a way traditional games just simply didn't or couldn't. This talk grew out of previous analysis that I've done on authentication and authorization processes, interfaces, and the other sort of related details as they may be attached to 200 games on Steam and every current major gaming platform. This included reading all EULAs, terms of service, etc. And platforms and publishers tend to be explicit that they actually don't sell games. They don't sell software. They don't sell media. They don't even sell services, despite these recent games of service movement. They lease or license heavily caveated forms of interaction with media or services, provided players abide terms and conditions. We are emphatically prohibited from copying, corrupting, modifying, redistributing, or otherwise risking the integrity of software, hardware, platform accounts, and or related services that we might access through the software that we, get permission to access. Implicitly, many of these EULAs actually prohibit us from preserving any aspect of these games because, again, one, we don't own them, and two, it would often require manipulating aspects of the software, especially if games must authenticate with central servers to permit access. Players do not need to verify with the publisher to confirm on whose coffee table they may install a chessboard or whether they individually are authorized to play on that board or color in the white squares or lend it to a friend or set it up in a museum. Those players are not told by the heads of board game companies that they should start getting comfortable with not owning the media they purchase access to the way that the Ubisoft CBO suggested players need to do with digital games not so long ago. At least in English, part of the challenges, I think, with addressing these shifts in ownership and preservation and navigating the sort of regulatory elements of this actually comes from basic lexicon. Game may refer to often intangible collection of rules and goals that exist independent of players, the sorts of things that scholars really love to argue about, or an individual expression of gameplay at a specific time and place. So instead of the game of chess, we have a game of chess or that game of chess over there. Or the physical or digital medium that represents the collection of rules and goals through which individual expressions manifest. For example, the boxes of physical boards and pieces within them, or even discs and cartridges. Frustratingly, though, even in observed EULAs, which exist entirely to define legal distinctions, they rarely actually distinguish between these different meanings. Because again, they don't even really care about games or gameplay in many senses. The ostensible goal of mitigating theft is probably worthwhile. However, the inability of players to own games and the ever-increasing demands that they ask permission to participate in every single instance of gameplay, it creates a significant challenge for digital game preservation, as some have already spoken about today. With no power demands, periodic software updates, or need for OS support, traditional physical games are comparatively easy to preserve. A dedicated collector with sufficient resources could hypothetically buy every board game, for example, and display them indefinitely. Eventually, even the rights to reproduce those materials become legal, extending the life of those games. However, digital games have long had issues with finite life cycles of electronic media, circuit wear and malfunctions, obsolescence, as again other folks have talked about. Oh, wow, okay. A digital game collector has to maintain a broad hardware ecosystem that permits access to those games from an entirely practical perspective, never mind sort of the legal elements of that. With digital games increasingly requiring networked access and authentication, even for offline gameplay, the games can become inaccessible if a company decides to turn off servers, regardless of players' desire to continue playing. This is at the heart of the Stop Killing Games movement, which other folks have brought up as well, but I'll skip right past. Digital gameplay is embedded within potentially unsupported the fact that digital gameplay is embedded within potentially unsupported software and platforms and subject to owners who can arbitrarily halt access is central to theoretical and practical preservation. Authorization and authentication are not wholly responsible for these challenges, but their imposition into the medium is one clear player-facing expression of the broader forces influencing this domain. Players needing to confirm, may I still be permitted to play your game today, is a fundamental evolution in everyday gameplay participation and preservation. Ultimately, with traditional games, only players and the material breakdown of games artifacts determine the end of gameplay participation or preservation. However, authorization and authentication and the systems behind them are at the core of larger digital mechanisms that make it difficult or illegal to participate and preserve gameplay after external administrative forces determine players may no longer access gameplay. And that's it.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you very much. That was amazingly on time.
I maybe rushed a little bit too much at the end there. I got scared of your sign.
Well, no, this is fantastic. Well done. And I just writing down my question. Okay, we have our last presentation. So Michael Iantorno from the University of Waterloo is going to talk about Lost in Space, restoring the Satellaviews ephemeral software library.
Thanks for the intro, and anybody just flag me if they can't hear or see anything. But yes, I'm Michael. I'm from the University of Waterloo, and this talk is titled Lost in Space. And it's a condensed version of an article I wrote on informal video game preservation practices, and it was based on my dissertation research. Let's start with the simple question. What is the Satellaview? Developed by Nintendo and the satellite broadcasting company St. Giga and active between 1995 and 2000, the Satellaview is a pedestal-like add-on for the Super Famicom that at one point allowed users to access a rotating collection of games, digital magazines, and other media using a satellite dish. And while satellite services are often monetized through subscription fees, Nintendo capitalized on Satellaview broadcasts using advertising and sponsorships. All that users needed to pay for was the prerequisite hardware, which was a satellite dish, a tuner to unscramble the broadcast signal, and the Satellaview system itself, which interfaced with the Super Famicom. In addition to this hardware, the Satellaview required two specialized technologies to access, download, and store content. The first was a cartridge whose name roughly translates into BSX, the town whose name was stolen. And this was bundled with every Satellaview system and served as an interface and BIOS, displaying a small, colorful town that users navigated to access content. And the second part of the Satellaview's cartridge configuration is a specialized 8 megabit memory pack that nested inside the town whose name was stolen and stored broadcast data. These memory packs housed a user's current game library, and while they could hypothetically be swapped in and out, typically users would overwrite data during each broadcast. What did they receive over satellite? This is a bit of a tricky question to fully answer, as there's no complete record of the Satellaview's broadcast schedule. Still, it's possible to identify four common types of content. First of which is games, which were sometimes play or level limited versions of commercial releases, or standalone titles such as Radical Dreamers. Game data, which users could integrate into other slotted cartridge games, such as map data for SD Gundam G Next. Magazines and books, which users could open and read on screen, such as PokeCam magazine. And SoundLink games, which combined live audio broadcasts with Super Famicom games to add voiceover, high-quality soundtracks, and other features. Regardless of the type of content, it was all written to the same 8 megabyte memory pack, which users would partially or fully overwrite whenever they opted into a new broadcast. And this is really the central problem of studying the Satellaview. It's impossible to construct anything close to a complete platform archive for the device, as there was never really a way to accumulate a stable, reliable software library. The Satellaview software persists only on scant traces left on memory packs, basically whatever users left on them before they turned off their console for the final time. These challenges harken back to Apperly and Parika's discussion of platform studies' epistemic threshold. The assumption underlying platform studies research is that in order for a platform to be viable for study, the evidence of its existence must be unambiguous, and it has to achieve a degree of stability and consistency as a technical object. And while you can still buy secondhand Satellaview hardware, and Nintendo did create a large amount of content for the device, it's impossible to fully experience its functionality. Its satellite infrastructures are now dormant, its software was never rendered into physical form, and Nintendo has largely been disinterested in stewarding the device. Phil Salvador notes that the piecemeal availability of past games, particularly those that were only made available through digital platforms, plagues efforts for comprehensive preservation. And he identifies some video game platforms as abandoned ecosystems whose owners do not even put forth a minimal concerted effort to re-commercialize them. And this results in software libraries that are pretty much unavailable through official channels. These platforms represent some of the biggest gaps in video game history. So in this absence of corporate stewardship, a dedicated group of citizen archivists have taken up Satellaview restoration, collecting its material remains, developing emulator add-ons, and archiving memory pack data. And just as a definitional point, citizen archivists are those who are not affiliated with an institution, they're not attached to a museum, but they take history into their own hands by developing expertise and building archives outside of formal venues. They often operate without gatekeepers and outside legal boundaries in ways that more formalized institutions cannot, leveraging legally gray activities such as ROM hacking and emulation. And currently, the backbone of these Satellaview recovery efforts is memory pack hunting. Citizen archivists purchase Satellaview memory packs from online marketplaces, each of which has the potential to hold previously undiscovered content. Some of the citizen archivists I spoke with likened this content hunt to gambling. I'm paying $40 for this little card. Let's hope that there's literally anything on it. And in the pictures on screen, you can see this recovery process in action. I used an analog NT and some community-made diagnostic software to dump and analyze a memory pack I had purchased online. And as I found in my own research, memory packs are not guaranteed to have anything on them. In addition to the natural content trend of daily broadcasts, Nintendo made content expire after a set number of plays, encouraging users to download the next demo or game. The diagnostic tool on screen shows some of the metadata that was used to implement this countdown feature. And because of this churn, the content from memory cards is heavily skewed towards the end of the Satellaview's lifespan. The most commonly recovered game is BS Panel de Pon, one of the last titles that Nintendo released for the Satellaview. When citizen archivists do find new content, they are quick to archive it in online repositories. Perhaps the most prevalent of these is the Satellablog, a website whose underlying goal is to make Satellaview content playable to as many people as possible by hosting an open and curated archive of finds. Now, circulating and archiving copyrighted game content raises many legal and moral questions that I really don't have time to address today. However, I do want to emphasize that while their work may be considered illegal or anarchic, citizen archivists have successfully restored much of the Satellaview software library, made it available to audiences outside of its intended jurisdiction, and provided a valuable glimpse into its history of use. And recently, they even began simulating broadcasts, allowing users to relive the Satellaview's functionality through an emulator. Thanks. I have a lot more to say about this, but it's in a paper, so you can scan that QR code if you want to read it and get a little bit more context on the study. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. Yes, okay. Everyone stayed fantastically to time. So yeah, we have about 15 minutes or so for questions. And we have our first question in the chat. Question from Willem for Michael. Speculative, but what would happen to the citizen archivists if Nintendo were to re-release this software on their own terms? For example, the Virtual Boy was recently made available again, and I suspect that Satellaview is now also in the realm of possibility.
Ooh, that's a good question. I actually don't think the Satellaview is in the realm of possibility simply because the software library is so tied up in other publishers. And it's also, I mailed Nintendo and asked if they had a Satellaview archive. They said no. I don't take that as a definitive answer, but it's maybe something that they're not interested in. But if we were to follow past patterns, I imagine that if Nintendo were to do this, they would sue the heck out of the people doing the stewardship, or at least send cease and desist orders. Typically, when Nintendo reinvests in an IP, they try to remove any informal emulation or ROM hacking or file sharing stuff related with the platform. So I could see them trying to reassert control. I don't think they would try to co-opt expertise. Sega's done that a few times, but it's not really in Nintendo's playbook. But beyond that, I don't think I can speculate more. Yeah, and I agree. Nintendo is very good at saying no. Thanks.
Also, just quickly for Michael, if you could put a link, like a site link to your article in the chat, just for people who missed the QR code. That'd be fantastic.
No problem. Yeah, I'll put it up.
So Anne has a fantastic question for everyone, but perhaps Ross and Daniel in particular. Do you have any thoughts on how the preservation culture may fare with other forms of media, such as film and ebooks, turning towards the more restricted practices of video games, e.g. subscription services, withdrawal of access, blocking, lending, sharing, etc.? Is the environment becoming more hostile to preservation across the board, rather than moving towards a paradigm which includes video games as well? And I'd just like to kind of add that a little extension, mostly for Daniel, about essentially the idea of kind of permission to borrow based capitalism, like post-capitalism, where we're moving away from the idea of owning anything. We're all employed on 0 hours contracts with subscription boxes for everything we own, and just whether this is just a manifestation of that. So, yeah, anyone's free to weigh in, but let's start with Ross, then Daniel, and then anyone else can turn on the camera and respond if they like.
Yeah, I'll be brief because would actually like to defer to Daniel quite a lot on this. I think his talk covered more aspects of that question than mine did. However, I have got a couple of thoughts. I did hint that there are political aspects to accessing material, what is legal, what is not. And although I think as academics, we shouldn't necessarily engage in direct lobbying work with government, I think there is a conversation to be had there, and that we can inform and advise governments on aspects of copyright law and whether exemptions can be given to material. I take, a comment that I think Daniel gave in particular about how we're buying access to a license and not the product itself. Who owns the thing? And because games are nebulous in themselves, their presentation, the platform, how they're experienced, that's really hard to nail down in law. So I'll finish up by saying I think there's some policy briefing work that could be done in this area. I've done a little bit of policy briefing work myself. There may be others who are better placed to do that kind of work. But I think engaging with policymakers and decision makers around the legal framework of access to that kind of material is probably quite key to that question. And that's all I want to contribute. Thank you. Great question.
And Daniel? Yeah.
I'll try to keep, I have two answers, but I'll try to keep them really short. The first one is that, I came at this work originally from a study of a sort of essentially the digitalization of games and the platformization of gameplay. And what I think sort of part of it is that, how I look at it is that, I don't think increasingly most of these companies aren't game companies in the sense that they started out as game companies. They were owned by people who programmed and designed and developed games, but they're increasingly operated by people who don't really know anything about games or give a shit about games. And so I think that the question highlights the fact that they're increasingly run by the same people, regardless of what medium that you're talking about. And so actually the decisions that are being made are very similar. And so I'm increasingly cynical about that. So I feel like the things that make me sort of optimistic about it across those same media is piracy. That somebody made a comment about that in an earlier talk, which I think is right. I think I feel like I'm optimistic, hopefully, about criminal illicit, stockpiles of everything. But also actually one thing maybe is also, we're seeing in the game industry this sort of rise of AA and indie titles that are actually still treating this like a media company, not a profit factory. And I feel like maybe that's a cause for optimism, and maybe we'll see a rise of, we just had a YouTuber do really well with a movie, and I haven't seen it. I don't know if it's any good, but maybe we'll see a rise of indie film. We've had indie film for a long time, but yeah. I just incredibly cynical because I did a lot of interviews with mobile developers where it's just the worst.
That's the movie you were talking about. That's Markiplier's Iron Lung film. Just such a weird game to adapt into a film. Just very odd. We've had a general sort of shout out in the chat. Would be super keen to chat with anyone who's interested in legal/policy frameworks from Abigail. So I think just anyone reply to that message if that's your field of interest. We've got a question specifically for Jean. Have you seen any signs of the porn/sex game community looking toward a monetization model that excludes mainstream payment processors? Does this hurt discoverability for them too much?
Yeah. So no, I haven't seen that for a couple reasons. Not to say it's not happening, but there's a couple things. So first is that it's really hard to overstate the power that payment processors have. My colleague in porn studies, Dr. Val Weber, has talked about the ways in which payment processors are effectively the controllers of a de facto global censorship regime. Or like governance regime, right? So they're just tremendously, they're almost impossible to get away from. And the network nature of that financial infrastructure also means that folks risk being debanked. So I have spoken to folks who have lost access to bank accounts and stuff like that, like more than once. So that is troublesome for them. And it's just, what I'm saying is it's hard to get away from that financial infrastructure. I know Itch had, when they initially did the delisting, had discussed going with what we often call like a high risk payment processor, who will, as in they'll accept higher risk, often in the context of sex work, camming, digital sex work, these kinds of things. But the cut for that is really high, is higher than a MasterCard would take. And so what that ends up meaning, and I don't know, I haven't, again, if you know anyone at Itch, let them know, I'd like to talk to them, but that, to implement those would mean that the whole site has to sort of accept that payment processing, I think is probably one of the tricky parts of it. And so really what ends up happening is we sort of like, we give up protection for porn and sex work in order to, like as a like tribute to the payment processors so that everything else can sort of continue. Some folks are moving towards, like in-person distribution, for example. But yeah, no, I feel folks feel pretty at the whims of payment processors, I think is how I would say
that. Thank you very much. Let me see. So I had so a question for Josefien. Just wondering about kind of you did your survey of the UK and Netherlands contexts for game preservation. I was just wondering if there was any kind of practices or principles that you'd encountered outside of these two institutional contexts, in kind of fan spaces or other kind of national preservation contexts that you didn't see represented in either of your two kind of core cases in terms of kind of how you treat the object.
Good question. Let me see. So just to get your question correct, so your question was about if I encountered, with the interviews, if I encountered practices that the Institute, I forgot what's the question again.
So basically it's, have you encountered any kind of practices around game preservation which aren't being practiced in either the UK or the Netherlands, but kind of with a sort of abstract understanding of the best practices in game preservation, like should be, or, or is, between the two cases, it's kind of pretty well represented?
Let me see. Yeah, I'm sorry. Like I have to summarizing my thesis in my head is really a difficult job to do. Let me see. What I overall can say, but that's the same, I think I said within the presentation, they approach communities, and they let communities give meaning to the games by either sharing emotional, like their stories, or letting people play games and then documenting that. I also read something about, for example, how piracy often, even though it's a very touchy subject because of legality, but also it's a way of preserving games which I think, maybe it was Sound Vision, but yeah, that has some legal wise it's not that good to do, I think. But yeah, sorry, I don't know how to answer that question correctly.
Oh, but no, this is
yeah.
This is all interesting.
Yeah.
You've also had a sort of request from Dany in the chat. Is your thesis accessible anywhere? Would you? Yeah.
I can share it. I forgot because it's my first time doing this ever, so I didn't have my email in my slides, but I can. I don't know. I can maybe like send it to people or share it here. It's not published anywhere, but before maybe I publish it, I have to ask maybe permission from the people I interviewed if I can also share it with other people. So, but yeah, I'm willing to share it, of course.
Yes, I mean, if you put your email in the chat, and then anyone can access it. Well, access you and find out about it. Fantastic. Okay. Okay, we've got 1 minute. Any questions I've missed? Okay, in which case, I've got, yes, my final question, which is for Dany, which is just a general curiosity about this idea of kind of historical curiosity as a kind of framework for engaging with retro games. And I was just thinking about it in the kind of in relation to there's a Welsh concept called hiraeth, which is nostalgia for a thing that you never experienced. So this idea of young people who had nothing to do with games made in the 90s reflecting on it with a nostalgia that isn't their own. Just wondering about how, whether you're conceptualizing this in your oral history projects.
So I was not that kind of whole thread of like nostalgia, historical curiosity came in from literally a meeting I had with my supervisor yesterday. So I added that at the very last minute. But I can kind of, I mean, yes, it's definitely something that's quite interesting. I think that should be taken into account. And I will take a note of it and put that in my thesis. But I mean, there's definitely something there, right? Where there's a lot of people, even at the time, who might not have experienced the game directly, or like a lot of people I interviewed, or from the stuff I see online, actually only experienced Dirty Devil through a demo that was on some of these demo discs, right? So never truly, not truly, but never fully experienced the game. And so there might be something, there's definitely something there, right? Where there's a certain nostalgia for something that they never truly experienced. But I like that kind of idea of, people are simply interested in something that's old, and there's a certain kind of suspension of, not of disbelief, but of almost this notion of like, the planned obsolescence, where we're consistently going to the next thing, going to something new, thinking that like whatever's in the present and or the future will necessarily be better and greater or whatever. And there's some worth to that. Camera controls at the time sucked. They're much better now. But there's a certain suspension of that when people experience those games, because they're putting themselves into a mindset of like, I'm playing an old game, therefore it will be different. It might not be it might be clunkier or something. So yeah, I mean, I don't have anything like particular to say about that, except to your question, except that perhaps it is interesting and it should be considered. And I think it does definitely happen, because there's a bunch of people who are into retro games and go back to these games and comment about it and think about them, and their experience is as relevant as someone who played the game or perhaps only heard about it or played only a demo or something, right? All of these experiences are 100% valid and will teach us something different.
Thank you very much. And thank you everyone for lightning talks. This was absolutely amazing. I'm sure everyone, myself included, have far more stuff they want to ask about. So yes, do all keep posted for how we're going to follow up this event with the Discords and etc. So we're going to have a 5-minute break. Loading screen before our final panel session. So we'll come back in at 8 minutes past. So yeah, see you then.